All right, thank you everyone for all the wonderful presentations so far. We're now nearing the end of the conference. So we have our very final keynote of the conference and of the day, Professor Ellora Derenoncourt. Ellora is a professor of economics at Princeton University. Recently, she was at UC Berkeley, where she was my colleague. She's done deeply inspiring work on labor markets and economic history. Her work specifically focuses on inequality. She's done a lot of work that has been really, truly transformational in many different ways on examining Northern backlash against the Great Migration and ensuring reduction in Black upward mobility and the role of federal minimum wage policies in closing the racial earning gap in the civil rights era. So Laura is going to be talking about some of this work, and we'll also get to hear from her during the panel alongside our first keynote speaker, Trooper Sanders. And we hope that you enjoy. And with that, Laura, take it over.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give this keynote. So as Rediat mentioned, I'm an economist at Princeton University. I am an economic historian. I also used to be Rediat's colleague at Berkeley, where I taught at the public policy school. So you might wonder what an economic historian has to say about policy today, and that's really the spirit of my talk this afternoon, at least on the East Coast. So I'll be talking about this idea that history can inform and shape, and should inform and shape, policy around inequality, and I'll be talking about that through the lens of racial inequality in the United States over the very long run. So this talk, Racial Inequality in the 21st Century, is thinking about this topic in the very distant past, but also the present and the future. And material in this talk is drawn from work with many fantastic collaborators and research assistants. They're mentioned at the bottom of this slide here. And with that, let me begin. All right, so we know that racial disparities in the US today are very large. But why should we care to study racial inequality in the past? So I'm going to make two arguments to kind of justify my existence as an economic historian, saying that we should pay attention to history for the purposes of designing good policies today. And there are two key reasons why I strongly feel that history can inform policy today. The first is that there are certain kinds of economic disparities between Black and white Americans where we really actually need the history to understand the magnitude of those gaps and also their degree of persistence and stubbornness. And I will be discussing this through the lens of the racial wealth gap in the US over the past 160 years. And I'll be making the argument that the gap today truly stems from starting conditions for Black and white Americans under the institution of slavery. The second reason that I feel history should inform policy today is that on many economic indicators, racial progress has stagnated. So you could think about wealth, wages, income, et cetera. We just haven't seen much change in the past several decades. And for ideas about how to reduce the gap going forward, we need to actually turn back the clock and see, when did these gaps actually move, and draw inspiration from a time in the United States, in the history of the United States, where policy was bolder. And I'll be discussing that through the example of federal minimum wage policy in the 1960s. So let's begin with the racial wealth gap. This continues to be the largest economic gap between Black and white Americans. So if you're to take a common statistic, the white to Black average wealth ratio, today that's 6 to 1. That's equivalent to Black Americans holding about 17 cents for every dollar of white wealth. You can compare that to the income ratio, which is substantial, but also substantially smaller, a gap of about 2 to 1, or Black Americans having about 50 cents of income for every white dollar of income. Now, what's striking about the racial wealth gap is it's been remarkably stable for the last 40 years. And you can see that in this figure this white to Black per capita ratio has been around, between 5 and 6 to 1 for the past 4 decades. So this is where, as an economic historian, I step in. Well, what has this looked like over a much longer time span? So my collaborators and I set about putting together the first, to our knowledge, time series of the racial wealth gap, starting from the pre-emancipation period in the 1860s to the present. And we do this by piecing together sleuthing for data, which is one of my favorite activities, from many, many different sources. For example, we draw on the historical US Census, which in 1860 and 1870 recorded wealth of the population. For the late 19th century and early 20th century, we draw on Southern state tax records. Sorry, I'm just noticing that my pictures have gone away. Picture very detailed reports that in this era in Southern states of Jim Crow record keeping actually recorded wealth of the Black and white population separately. We then turn to the work of Monroe Nathan Work, a preeminent Black sociologist who published annual statistics of Black economic progress and who reported some of the only estimates we could find of aggregate Black wealth in the United States. And then finally, covering the last 70 years, we draw on the Survey of Consumer Finances, a nationally representative survey that asks respondents about their financial status and wealth levels. And this carries us forward to the present. Once we've put together this full time series, 160 years of the Black-white wealth gap, what do we learn? Well, this stagnation in the recent period is nothing new. And the wealth gap overall has a very clear pattern from the pre-Civil War period to the present. It's a hockey stick. Convergence was rapid in the initial 50 years after emancipation, with the gap starting at a level of 60 to 1. That's 2 cents of Black wealth for every dollar of white wealth, converging to a level of 20 to 1 by 1870, to a level of about 10 to 1 by 1920. But if you look at the past 100 years, we haven't seen that much movement in the racial wealth gap. So what can explain this very persistent pattern and this very striking period of convergence in a time period where we might think, well, historical discrimination is at an all-time high during Southern redemption right after the Civil War? We're going to understand this evolution of the racial wealth gap with a very simple model. We write down a process for wealth accumulation that will apply to each group in the population, white Americans and Black Americans, and think about this starting from the historical period through the present. We model wealth tomorrow as a function of wealth today, so those are the W's, with these time indices. Wealth today plus savings from income Y, which together appreciate at a capital gains rate Q. Income has its own growth process determined by this growth rate G. The growth rate of the racial wealth gap, again measured as the ratio of white to Black wealth, is going to be determined by 2 key forces: differences in wealth appreciation rates, or these capital gains rates for each group, and differences in savings, of which the savings rate and existing levels of income and wealth are a component. So taking this very simple model, we're going to embark on a thought experiment. Suppose starting just after emancipation, we imagine that Black and white Americans have what we call equal conditions for wealth accumulation, meaning in our model that wealth appreciation rates are identical across the 2 groups as are savings rates. we're going to plug in the observed income growth rates for the two groups that we see in our data. And we're going to start things off in 1870 with the initial wealth and income gaps. That's a gap of 20 to 1 and a gap of 4 to 1 approximately, respectively. Let's see what happens. Voila, a hockey stick shape of wealth convergence. So in the first few decades after emancipation, what we see is rapid convergence, followed by that familiar slowdown in racial wealth convergence. And recall, this is under the scenario where we have equal conditions for wealth accumulation for Black and white Americans. We can use this model to think through a few different scenarios and to compare the observed convergence to what would come out of this model and this ideal benchmark of equal conditions for the two groups. What we see is that in blue here, the observed data, wealth convergence has in fact been much slower. That's consistent with, of course, Black and white Americans not facing equal conditions of wealth accumulation over the past 150 years. So the gap today is more like 6 to 1. In the black here, these numbers on the side, you can see what our model would predict. If Black and white Americans had equal conditions for wealth accumulation, today the racial wealth gap would still be 3 to 1, white Americans holding triple the amount of wealth of Black Americans. Furthermore, in the year 2230, over 200 years from now, you'll see that the racial wealth gap hasn't converged, even under this ideal scenario. The gap remains about 40%, white American wealth 40% higher than Black American wealth. So this is quite striking. We have, even in an ideal benchmark, convergence basically never happening. And we know that in reality, the two groups have not faced equal conditions. There's been discrimination in financial markets, housing markets, and an inability through expropriation, through racial violence, for Black Americans to accumulate the same amount of wealth over generations as white Americans. Given that the two groups in reality face different conditions for wealth accumulation, what can we say about the future of the wealth gap? In the dark line, we use our estimates of observed differences in wealth appreciation rates and savings, and we compare that to, again, our sort of ideal scenario in the lighter gray line here, where wealth accumulation conditions are equalized. What we see is that in the dark line above, we're not really any longer headed towards convergence. We're headed towards some kind of steady state, a wealth gap of about 5 to 1 or 4 to 1. Under this ideal benchmark, we get continued convergence. It still takes a really long time. Now, most policies that seek to close the racial wealth gap focus on things like savings rates differences between Black and white Americans, or discrimination in the labor market, income differences, or trying to encourage, financial literacy, investing in the right kinds of, stock equity, portfolio diversification. These all boil down to tinkering with the Q and S and the differences in those parameters between the two groups. We run a few numbers to ask the question, what would we really require along those parameters to get convergence in, say, 30 years? Does that seem like a decent enough time to try to have some equality on this measure? It would take income growth rates for Black Americans of 10%, a savings rate of 30%, or a capital gains rate of 5%. Now, you can compare that to the numbers for white Americans, respectively 1.3%, 5%, or 2%. In other words, we're just not really going to get there very quickly focusing on these parameters. We then consider policies that try to explicitly take into account the origins of the wealth gap. For example, we examine the policy for reparations put forward by Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen in their new book, From Here to Equality, a flat payment of about $267,000 for each eligible Black American descendant of the enslaved. Now, obviously, a policy that targets the origins of the wealth gap, the magnitude that it's developed into today, is going to bring the gap much more quickly down into sort of the range of the income gap. And that's what we find. So food for thought for the racial wealth gap and what history has told us about why we have such persistent levels of the gap and why such high levels. In the remaining time, I want to sort of maybe end on a brighter note. We can also use history to understand or to get ideas about policies that can facilitate convergence. So rather than kind of feeling like we're in a rut that we'll never get out of, sometimes when you turn back the clock, you find a moment of policy experimentation in US history that's actually quite bolder than today. And the example I'll be drawing on is minimum wage policy in the 1960s. So I'm now showing you a different form of economic inequality between Black and white Americans, which is the earnings gap between Black and white workers. Here represented as the difference in average logged annual earnings. So we can roughly interpret this as percentage differences in earnings. Now, I'm showing you here this gap from 1950 to the present. In the beginning of the period, the first couple of decades, the gap is around 50%, meaning Black workers earning about 50 cents for every white dollar. By the end of the period, the gap is more like 25%, Black workers earning 75 cents for every white dollar. What's very striking about this picture is that there was a single decade in which the gap closed by a factor of 2, the late 1960s and early 1970s. This period has been a bit of a puzzle for economists for decades. Why did it fall so quickly and so dramatically? Naturally, a lot of the explanations had to do with the civil rights era and anti-discrimination legislation, as well as dramatic improvements in relative schooling outcomes for Black children relative to white children, convergence in education. But there's something that is missing from these explanations. Improvements in education take a while to show up in labor market earnings. They won't instantly result in reductions in the earnings gap. And the precise timing of this very dramatic reduction, basically starting in 1967, doesn't really match with some of the canonical civil rights legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965. My co-author and I identify an entirely different explanation for why the gap closed so quickly and so dramatically, which was expansions in federal minimum wage coverage in the late 1960s. So this image here just gives you a sense of the evolution of the federal minimum wage from its inception in the 1930s as part of the New Deal. Now, when the minimum wage was first introduced, this was an era that was, very much marked by racist public policy making. Southern legislators, fought hard to exclude Black Americans from a lot of New Deal era government programs. Now, the minimum wage is one of those. When it was first introduced, it only applied to industries like manufacturing, where it was very difficult for Black workers to get jobs due to rampant labor market discrimination. It did not apply to sectors where they were overrepresented: services, retail, agriculture. And it wasn't until the late 1960s that this was remedied. So in the blue line here, you see the level of the federal minimum wage in the industries where it was first introduced and over time in 2017 dollars. In red, you can see the introduction or the extension of minimum wage coverage to industries like restaurants, hotels, laundries. These are some of the canonical minimum wage industries of today, and they weren't covered until a full 30 years after the original law. Now, the other thing to note about the evolution of the federal minimum wage in real terms is that the late 1960s continued to be the highest minimum wage the US has ever seen. Today's minimum wage, $7.25, In 1968, in today's dollars, $10. So what we had happen here was the sudden introduction of a wage floor at essentially the highest level the federal minimum wage has ever been. Now, we do some more data sleuthing because it turns out that the 1960s are a difficult period in which to examine data on hourly wages and their evolution. And we digitize these old reports that allow us to get very detailed information on the number of workers paid in fine hourly wage bins by industry, by region, and for different groups of workers. This allows us to see the dramatic impact that this law had on the earnings of workers. I'm showing you here for workers in laundries in the US South, the distribution across different hourly wage bins on the x-axis here. So the number of workers paid each hourly wage bin in the thousands. And these different lines represent different years. For example, the dark line with hollow circles is the wage distribution in 1966, where you can see a lot of mass below $1. These are nominal dollars, so $1 in 1967. You see in 1967, after the minimum wage is introduced, a gigantic spike right at $1. These are workers being moved up to the minimum wage. So you can see this is going to be a transformational policy when it comes to wages. We're going to use this feature of the law to understand how this law impacted and to isolate the impact of the minimum wage on earnings for workers and on earnings gaps. So what we do is we look at the gap between workers who were in the industries that were previously covered and workers that are in the newly covered industry. What you see is that the relative earnings of workers in the newly covered industries spikes right after the introduction of the minimum wage. And this continues for several decades afterwards. We then examine the impact of the law on white and Black workers separately. And what we find is that the impact on, first of all, both white and Black workers in the newly covered industries saw very large wage gains. The second thing that we find is that Black workers experienced wage gains that were twice as large as the wage gains of white workers. And that has to do with where they fall in the earnings distribution prior to the law coming in. They're concentrated at the bottom. Now, whenever you talk about the minimum wage in economics, there's always a debate about the employment effects of the reform. Disproportionate job loss for Black Americans would offset these disproportionate wage gains, for example. So we look at the impact of the law on employment, and we find a precise zero effect. This holds for different subgroups of workers, men, women, Black, white, etc. This means that these gains are real. They're not offset by job loss, and the minimum wage was able to close what we call the income gap, the gap not just between workers, but between the two groups as a whole. In fact, the minimum wage can explain about 20% of the decline in racial inequality during the civil rights era. This is massive, about as large as the effect of schooling improvements on the earnings gap. So economists might not have been aware of the role the minimum wage could play, but civil rights activists were perfectly well aware. In fact, in the 10 demands from the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, demand number 9 was for an expanded minimum wage that would cover all areas of employment. I'd like to mention here that demand number 8 was for a national minimum wage that would pay $2 an hour in 1963 dollars. That's about just over $15 an hour now. So when I say that we can turn to history to get policy ideas, I really mean it. There are lists that we can look at. All right, so my time is wrapping up, and I just want to end on the note that, the future of racial inequality is really up to us. And we make policy choices as a society that can determine the evolution of these various economic gaps. And in the interest of leaving some time for questions, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellora, for that wonderful presentation.